Hi, I'm Sarah Green. I'm talking today with Michael Raynor, a director at Deloitte Services LP. Michael, thanks for coming in.
It's my pleasure.
In your HBR article and in your book, you are really searching for the key driver of long-term corporate performance. But what's interesting about your work is I think it's a little different than the work of a lot of other people who've looked for that holy grail. So tell us, what does make it different in your opinion?
Well, there's, I hope, at least two things that set this work apart that make it worth doing. There are, after all, as you point out, no shortage of other attempts to uncover the behavioral drivers of long-term superior performance. But it seemed to my co-author and I, Mumtaz Ahmed, that a lot of this previous work was not based on a statistically sound sample. And what I mean by that is that what constitutes superior corporate performance is not self-evident. It's not good enough to sort of pick 10 or 15 or even 20 or 30 years and rank order companies and pick the ones at the top of the list and say, well, they're exceptional. Fundamentally, what that overlooks is that every system is subject to enormous variation. And what constitutes exceptional performance has to be more than just what happens to be in the right tail of the distribution. That's what gets referred to as the lucky random walkers. And so we wanted companies that were so good for so long that we had a quantifiable certainty that those companies had, in fact, done better than you would have expected due to good luck alone. And so it was on the basis of that approach to the problem that we identified the full population of exceptional companies that have ever existed anywhere in the U.S., all publicly traded companies between 1966 and 2010, over 25,000 companies over that time period. But then when it came to trying to understand what actually drove their exceptional performance, we forced ourselves to come up with behavioral explanations that were tied to the underlying structure of their advantage. So we would take their performance advantage and pull it apart into the various constituent elements: return on sales, asset turnover, gross margin. And as a consequence, when we went looking for behavioral explanations, we were constrained in what constituted an acceptable response. We were forced to tie our explanation back to those fundamental financial drivers.
Well, and what is interesting, I think, about this approach is that when you were talking about the methodology in the HBR piece, you did say that you were looking for what companies did differently, and you couldn't really come up with anything, and then you started looking for how they thought differently, and that's how you came up with these 3 rules. So maybe just walk us through some of those rules.
Absolutely. So we went through a lot of the same behaviors that others have picked up on the past, right? Mergers and acquisitions, the nature of the CEO leadership style, the ownership structure, a lot of things that other people have pointed to and said that feels like it's part of the explanation. And we wouldn't say that those things don't matter. That would be silly. Of course they matter. But what we couldn't find was any systematic relationship between the choices that they made, the specifics of the choices they made. Do they acquire or do they build it at home? Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. That's not much help. And so what we had to do was take a step back and say, wait a minute, is there any underlying pattern in what appear to be the decision-making criteria that these companies are employing as they make choices over time? And that's when pieces started to fall into place. And what we ended up with in the 3 rules were what seemed to us, at least, to be the way in which these companies answered 3 questions over time. So the first question they have to answer: how do you create value for customers? And there the answer is rule number 1, better before cheaper. Don't compete on price, find ways to compete on non-price dimensions of performance. But the second thing every company has to do is capture value for themselves in the form of profits. And what we found there is that exceptional companies drive superior profitability through rule number 2, revenue before cost. Don't try and drive superior profitability with a structural cost advantage. Drive superior profitability with a structural revenue advantage. Third rule: how do you cope with change over time? And for us, the third rule is there are no other rules. And what that means is change anything and everything about your company as required in order to hew to rules number 1 and 2.
So if you are an executive or a CEO and they've bought into your framework, they believe in the methodology.
And why wouldn't they?
And they should, as they should. And if they are then looking at all their competing priorities and saying, okay, so if I know this, then how do I operationalize it? What would you tell them about how to sort of balance those priorities and make those choices?
That's a great question. I mean, the first thing I'd like to point out is that we're not confused. We think the rules are very helpful. We think that they can really bring some focus and some clarity to decision making in a great many contexts, but they are a long way away from a complete recipe for corporate success, right? So the way I think of it is that if somebody could come to you and give you a map to get you from wherever you are to the success you seek, well then you should buy that book, because I don't have a map. What Mumtaz and I think we have is a compass. It's something that points you in the right direction. And so the way we think about it is that over time, you want to make sure that you're consistently bearing north. Every single decision that gets made in your organization, it will very often be highly ambiguous. Does it make sense to cut costs? Well, sure. Does it make sense to try and differentiate? Well, sure. So how do you make the call? And the hope is that what these rules do is they allow organizations to handicap those choices over time so that they consistently make the choices that cumulatively will lead them to the results they seek.
Well, Michael, it is a great compass, and thank you for coming in today.
My pleasure.